Thank you. So, thank you very much for having me. Once upon a time, there were these things called books. They're awful things, heavy to carry around, and they consisted of these things called pages. Do you happen to remember this, some people? And you flip them, they hurt your fingers, right? Cut your fingers. Awful things. I'm glad these books aren't around anymore. So happy about that. But this concept of the page that's been around with us for the last couple millennia has carried over into the web, right? It's been an integral part of the vocabulary of the web for quite some time. But this metaphor no longer makes sense because this is our reality, right? We have this plethora of smartphones, dumb phones, netbooks, notebooks, e-readers, tablets, web-enabled TVs, game consoles, a whole bunch of other things that can now access the web. So we're forced to create designs that work well across all of these different screen sizes, but our old processes haven't quite caught up, right? So now this is how we're articulating our designs, right? Hey client, here's how your website will look on a MacBook Pro, or a MacBook Air, or an iMac, it's always those, and an iPad, and an iPhone. And we will tilt them slightly to go, ooh, ooh, I get this, right? So here's what your web page will look like on this, and here's what this is a tremendous waste of time, right? This is a tremendous waste of talented designers' time. So we quite literally have to blow it up, right? Blow up our interface. I've been thinking about this question for a long time. What are our interfaces made of, right? What are the web's Lego bricks? What are the web's Subway sandwich pieces that we could arrange into millions of different delicious combinations? Right? I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because I run a site called This Is Responsive, which is a collection of responsive patterns, right? What can you put onto an interface and how do you make those work across different screen sizes and environments? So this idea of designing systems rather than pages has been around for a long time. People like Andy Clark have been talking about this for years now. But it matters more than ever because, as it turns out, this whole multi-device web thing is sort of hard, right? So we have tools that come in to help us. Anybody familiar with Foundation, right? Anybody using that? Okay. How about our friend Bootstrap? Any Bootstrap people in here? Okay. It's okay. It's all right. I'm not judging you. I am, but I think these things are great, right? They give us these design systems. They make it quicker and easier to make a responsive web interface and things like that. I think it's really phenomenal for sort of whipping something together, showing interactivity, and prototyping something out. But this is my problem with things like Bootstrap. Look at these happy people. Like whenever I watch sci-fi movies or TV shows as a kid, I guess I would think I'd say, I guess if just given enough time, we just solve fashion. We're just like, from now on, we're all just wearing jumpsuits, right? Fashion, check, right? Let's move on to music, right? This isn't how human beings work, right? We all have different needs, we all have different opinions, different goals, things like that. So, while these tools like Bootstrap are helpful, but they are these sort of one-size-fits-all solutions that give you, right, your design answers, right? So if Nike and Adidas and Puma and any other shoe manufacturer, if they all use Bootstrap to make their websites, they would look substantially similar. That's not really what they're going for, right? These tools give us a lot. They, in fact, give us too much, right? A bunch of bloat and unneeded stuff, right? You might not use everything in these toolkits. On the flip side of that coin, they might not go far enough, and so you end up having to write a bunch of custom stuff anyways and design a bunch of custom stuff anyways. How do you work these in with your existing sites? And you have to subscribe to the way some other web designer, developer named things, right? which might not make sense for you and your project. So, again, conceptually, these tools are amazing, right? What we want to do is create these design systems. But, as my friend Dave Rupert says, that responsive deliverable should look like fully functioning Twitter Bootstrap style systems, but they're custom tailored for your needs, right? They're custom tailored for your organization, for your client's goals, for your client's needs. So that's what's given rise to a lot of these, sort of custom-made pattern libraries and front-end style guides. And the benefits of these are many, right? At the end of the day, you want to promote consistency and cohesion, right? People view your brand, view your organization, view your product or service as a singular entity, right? So that cohesion, that continuous experience as people traverse across all of your property should remain consistent. It makes things easier to test, right? What's causing you problems? What's causing page slowness? Things like that. You're able to sort of pull things apart and lay it all out on the table and figure that out. Establishes a better workflow between all disciplines involved in a project. You're creating this shared vocabulary, right? You're all calling things the same thing. And it serves as this useful resource to keep coming back to grow with and evolve with as your product grows over time. So there's a bunch of tools out there for this. Some, making tools for, your own personalized style guide, things like Pattern Primer, and this one's called Barebones. And basically, these are all sort of freely available tool. And if you crack open the hood of these things, it's like, here's what our header looks like. Here's what a paragraph looks like. Here's what small text looks like. Here's what a horizontal list of links looks like. Here's what a vertical list of links looks like. Right? Here's what our form fields look like, and notes about the forms, and the required field, all these things. These are, again, establishing your building blocks. And we've been seeing an increasing number of these things released into the wild. This is Code for Americas, which is done by Clear Left in Brighton, England, and just phenomenal work. Right? MailChimp released their pattern library. Yelp released their pattern library, made a reference to atomic design. It all sort of started with Starbucks. So Starbucks released a responsive redesign about 2.5 years ago, something like that. But whenever they released their new site, they also released their pattern library. And if you crack this thing open, you see things like this, right? So they're calling this pattern the blocks 3 up pattern, right? So it's this pattern of 3 touts with some images, and you're able to resize the browser and sort of see how it works across different screen sizes. Here's a featured list consisting of a thumbnail and a title and an excerpt, right? Again, a common pattern that they're going to use throughout their interface, right? Data tables. Here's a little table with 3 columns. It'll squish quite nicely onto smaller screens, but then here's one that's a little more complex, and how do we deal with that? Right? I love these. I think that this is absolutely the way that people should be approaching their web projects in 2014 and beyond. But there's a problem with these, right? One, they're time-consuming to create. I don't know about you, but I don't have a whole lot of idle time on my hands. I'm not like, what am I going to do today at work? Maybe I'll make a pattern library. Like these things take a lot of time to create. And as a result, they're sort of treated as this extra thing, right? Oh, well, we'll get around to it if we have time, or oh, we just don't have the budget for this, right? They're often too abstract, right? You get to see all these sort of components floating around, but you don't really get a sense of context, right? How are these things used in the final interface? Go. I believe in you, remote. Yes. Sometimes they're only seen as a designer or developer tool. So, they're not useful for clients or for project owners or product owners. This is a foolish trap to fall into, right? They're often only created after a project launches, right? You launch the website and sort of go in and cherry pick patterns after the fact. They're often only serving present use cases, right? What if your organization doesn't do a lot of video work right now, but in the future, maybe you do, right? Wouldn't it be great to solve for that sort of now and think of that in terms of your system? And then the last thing, and the biggest thing that I sort of set out to try to figure out was this lack of methodology, right? Right now, if you look at Bootstrap or any of the live style guides out there, it's just more or less this sort of random spray of patterns. And it sort of lacks this methodology. So that's what sort of caused me to think about things and arrived at what I now call atomic design. So what atomic design is, it's a weird slide. I'll just let you soak it in for a second. My chemistry teacher, who I wasn't able to find a picture of, looked a lot like Wilford Brimley. So that's a picture of Wilford Brimley. But yeah, I had a high school chemistry teacher. We had to do all this chemical equation, sort of balancing chemical equations, working with, atoms and molecules and things like that. And as I kept coming back, looking for parallels for interface design, I kept coming back to this high school chemistry class. So in the natural world, there are things called atoms, right? Hydrogen atom, oxygen atom. These things have unique properties. They can't be broken down any further without losing their meaning. These atoms combine to form molecules, right? Hydrogen atom combine together, form a water molecule. Now all of a sudden they have their own unique properties, right? This molecule has its own unique properties. Those molecules continue to combine together into more complex molecules. Those molecules keep combining together to form sort of simple organisms, right? Which keep combining together to form more complex organisms, like a person. This is actually, if you do a Google search for people, this guy showed up, and I'm like, yeah, this is pretty accurate, actually. Dude in beret and windbreaker and reflective drop shadow, pretty accurate. So, but all known matter, I kept him in there, all known matter in the known universe is comprised of this finite set of atomic elements. As it turns out, we have that in the web too. So a guy named Josh Duck put together the periodic table of HTML elements, which is pretty cool. So here's all of your different table elements. Here's all of your different text level elements. Here's all of your sort of form elements. I think that's super clever, right? But like the natural world, right, which has its finite building blocks, this is what we have to work with too. So we could apply that same process that happens in the natural world to our interface designs. And that's what atomic design is this sort of 5 distinct steps in crafting an effective interface design system. So we'll start with atoms. So again, coming back to these atoms, they're small, they're the smallest units, they can't be broken down any further, right? So crafting our interfaces, well, we have things like a label. We have things like an input field. We have things like a button. And again, these things have their own properties, can't be broken down any further, but they're often sort of abstract, right? But things start coming together whenever we put them together as molecules, right? So we take these atoms and put them together to form the search form molecule, right? So this molecule here is a relatively simple module or component, if you will, right? Now all of a sudden this label means something. It's describing that input, and clicking that button actually does something. Now you have this nice self-contained piece of functionality, this self-contained piece of interface. So now we could take this a step further and take this molecule, take the search form molecule, and put it into context of a header organism. Right? So an organism is a relatively complex module or component, right? So this header organism might be comprised of a logo atom, of a primary navigation molecule, of a search form molecule. And all of this collectively forms this standalone chunk of interface, right? And we see this all the time, right? You go to literally any website, you're going to see these sort of self-contained pieces of content, these self-contained pieces of interface, right? And like a header, which might be comprised of an image and different kinds of things, right? Navigation, forms, and things like that. It also might be like a tweet list organism, which is comprised of the same tweet repeated over and over and over and over and over again, right? So now we could take this a step further. Now we have these sort of relatively complex components, and now we put these organisms in their place in the form of a template, which is, a web page-based sort of layout thing. But the big difference here is that we're not focused, this isn't the final form. This is really focused on content structure, right? And Mark Bolton had a really great post sort of in defense of lorem ipsum and placeholder content and things like that. And what he's saying is basically you need to know what your content structure is. Not necessarily knowing what the actual final output is going to be, what your final copy deck looks like, what your final images look like. In order to design a proper system, you just need to know, how long are our headlines? What size images do we have available, right? What are raw materials that we're working with? What is our content structure? So that's the template level. And then what the page level is doing is taking this sort of content structure that's defined in the template level and pouring in real representative content. Now, this is obviously a massive, massively important step because this is what the end user is going to see, right? This is the final form. But this step is obviously important for other reasons because it's here where you either validate or invalidate your design decisions, right? It's not about sort of, creating these little bits and pieces, these atoms and molecules sort of in isolation because you don't really know, how they're going to come together in the final interface. So it's at this page level where you're able to see, well, maybe this headline does wrap onto 7 lines whenever I put in the real content. So maybe we need to go back through and solve this design pattern at a more atomic level. So that is what atomic design is. So atoms to molecules to organisms to templates to pages. Now this isn't like a linear process. All of this is sort of happening concurrently throughout your design process. And in working this way for the last year and a half or so, found that, the atoms, again, are sort of these abstract, very blown apart bits and pieces, while, that those pages are the most put together final form of the interface. I've also found that, the clients aren't too, they don't care too much about seeing all these bits and pieces flying around. But it is important for them to understand, that you're not just creating them a bunch of ad hoc web pages, but you're actually crafting this very deliberate system for them. At the end of the day, the creators are the ones that need to understand in full, how this stuff all comes together. And lastly, atoms aren't terribly useful on their own as you're sort of seeing this list of, all of your elements and paragraphs and form fields and things like that. And the pages on the other end of the spectrum are mostly there for review, again, to sort of see how, put together your system is actually coming. But the real work sort of happens in the middle. So this type of thinking, right, sort of deconstructing things into components, this has been around for a long time, and increasingly there's other fields, in the world of CSS, there's things like BEM and OOCSS and SMACS. They're sort of delivering sort of a more modular approach to how we approach our content. But even things like YUI and jQuery UI, which have been around for ages now, this type of thinking has been here. It just matters more than ever now. Right? With the rise of all of these different devices and the rise of all of these complications that happen to our workflow in trying to create web experiences for all these different devices, it's now more important than ever. So that's the theory of atomic design. In order to actually execute this, we created a tool, me and a guy named Dave Olson, who's a web developer in the US. And so what Pattern Lab is this sort of system that sort of allows you to stitch together all of your interface components into your final, front-end code. What it's meant to serve as, and the way that I've been using this is sort of my final deliverable to my clients, is that Twitter Bootstrap style system, right? I'm not just giving them, here's what your homepage looks like. I'm also giving them, this really sound, robust style guide, pattern library that they could use and grow upon. So provide some patterns to get started with. It's a design toolkit. What it isn't, though, is it's not Twitter Bootstrap. It's not Foundation. It doesn't give you the answers. It doesn't say, hey, here's what your buttons should look like, right? That's for you to do, right? That's for, your organization. Your designs have much different considerations than other people, so it's still up to you to do the actual design and development work. It's not language, library, style, or workflow dependent, right? So if you like using certain technologies, cool, go for it. If you don't like using jQuery or don't like using Sass or something like that, sure, that's fine too. It's also not incredibly rigid. It's very loosely named. You could even rip out all of the atoms and molecules language and use what makes sense for you. So it's not a thing for sale. It's just to point that out and be quite clear. It's just an open source project. It's also not just a pattern library, but it's also not like a full-on, you're not going to launch your website. This isn't like a replacement for Jekyll or WordPress or something like that. You still need to integrate it with a content management system. So here's what it looks like. This looks like shit. It's intentional. That is, very deliberate. Again, this is meant to be replaced with your own designs, and we're trying to make that abundantly clear. But what we do have is a nice little sort of header where you can sort of traverse between all the different patterns that you've defined yourself. And whenever you get into the atoms level, you look at things like, okay, here's your color palette, right? Again, these are elemental aspects of your design, right? What are our hex values, right? What are our brand colors, right? What are the fonts, right? What are our brand fonts? What does the font stack look like, right? But even invisible things like animations, right? Like there should be consistency in our animations across our interface, right? Again, this is sort of another sort of very abstract but yet elemental aspect of our interface. As you scroll down, though, you get, here's what our headings look like, here's what paragraphs look like, block quotes, formatted text, horizontal rules. Here's our different image types, our logos, our hero units, right? Our profile avatars, our icon fonts, spinners, right? All of our different form fields. So, and again, this is meant to be fully customized. This is meant to be replaced with whatever your design necessitates. So this is a project we did. We recently redesigned TimeInc.com, a big magazine publisher in the States. And so these were some of the components that we came up with for this. So this is a nice little block. It has a title, it has an excerpt, and it has a timestamp, right? And we're using this a bunch of different places in the interface. Here's another pattern, right? So we have this little header image, and then a title and an excerpt, right? Pretty common interface pattern. Again, we're sort of establishing these things for reuse, right? We're building these things. And in order to do this, we're using a templating language called Mustache. Now, fair warning, I know you guys just ate, and not everyone understands code here. Please don't throw up. I promise it's not this complicated. I'll try to keep it simple and sort of skim over this. Basically, at the end of the day, what we're looking at here, this little include, this little caret here, is basically saying include an atom named thumb. And that's what that thing is an atom that I've called thumb. Right? And so now I have this nice little chunk of code, this nice little chunk of interface that I can now include elsewhere using that same little caret, that same little include pattern. So then whenever we build up to organisms, these more complex organisms, like a header of a website, this is another project I did for TechCrunch, which is a technology blog owned by AOL in the States. And you crack open the hood for this. Come on. There we go. So you see a header, and then I'm including the advertisement, I'm including the logo, I'm including the navigation, I'm including the search, I'm including the social navigation. And now I can include that little chunk of interface in other things, right? And so then we get up to the template level. And so back to TimeInc, this is for another project we did for Entertainment Weekly, which is a publication in the States. We're including things like the header, we're including things like the article and the social share and comments and things like that. And so what you're left with is something that looks a little like this, where you sort of have, again, the focus is on the content structure, right? How big is that image? How long are these headlines? Things like that. And then whenever you get to the page level, back to Time Inc. So here's our template that we had for Time Inc. Here's how big the image is. Here's how long the characters are. For each of these patterns, we're reusing the same pattern sort of a number of different times on the home page. And then what we're doing at this page level is pouring in, there we go, real actual content, right? Pouring in placeholder content, testing out, different images, different headlines, and things like that. And again, at this stage, this is where we're validating, like, do things still hold up? Does our system that we've established still hold up and ring true? And if not, then we should address it. So sort of coming back to what a template looks like, we sort of are giving these things a name using little things like these pound signs. So I'm calling this the hero area, right? And I'm including the little hero video. And what we could do is we could actually swap out that placeholder content with real representative content. So in this case, we're loading in an image of Beyonce because we learned everyone loves Beyonce. We could have made the worst website in the world, and as long as we included a picture of Beyonce, they would have given it the thumbs up. So pro tip there, guys, take this back to your work. Throw in some Beyonce, you guys you'll get approval. Right, some other areas. Again, we're swapping out these sample images with images of this ice skater and showing, stuff from the Olympics and things like that. And what this allows you to do, especially from a business perspective, so what I'm just showing a bunch of code. What this allows you to do is write something once, change it once, and have it propagate anywhere it's included. And this is tremendously powerful. This saves a ton of time. Historically, in static environments like Photoshop and things like that, if you wanted to make a change to this little sort of window or show what different size people's names look like, you would have to go in and manually edit every single instance of that, right? It's extremely time consuming, and again, this isn't the best use of a good designer's time. So in addition to a viewer, or in addition to sort of this thing that allows you to stitch together all these patterns to form your final interface, your final website, we're also including a viewer, a viewport resizer. So, with the rise of responsive design, the rise of all these iPhones and things like that, we've seen a lot of these values get thrown around, right? 320 pixels is the width of an iPhone 4 in portrait view, right? Width 480 is an iPhone 4 in landscape view, right? 768 pixels, an iPad in portrait view. 1024 pixels, an iPad in landscape view, or a desktop browser. Right? The Fold. Oh God, the Fold. Right? How often do we have to have that conversation, guys? Let's put it to bed. But so it's up to us to no longer pay attention to just iPhone screens and to just iPad screens and to just, desktop screens. It's up to us to craft an interface that looks and works beautifully across the board. So that's what this tool is. I call it Ish because every time you click on the button, you click on small, it gives you a small-ish viewport. You click on medium, and it gives you a medium-ish viewport. And this isn't so much a developer tool. This has everything to do with being a client and team education tool to get people away from thinking in terms of, oh, what does it look like on the iPhone? Right? Or, oh, what does it look like on the iPad? Now, not saying that those things aren't important, but there's so many other devices, both present and future, that are going to be accessing this site that you need to account for that right out of the gate, right? You need to embrace the inherent fluidity of the web, and that means getting away from these fixed, rigid, mental models of device classes, like, oh, mobile, tablet, desktop, right? We're just trying to make one good interface that works everywhere. Ish also includes disco mode, which is just bounces your screen around like crazy. And again, the whole idea behind this is again, not as a developer tool, but to really drive home that point that, yes, this is what we're trying to do. We are trying to make an interface that looks and functions well anywhere. And that helps people appreciate all the efforts that are going into creating a truly effective, responsive design. In addition to these tools, we also include some annotations. So this is a big one wherever basically, in my world at least, we would create these 300-page annotated PDFs, these wireframes that would ultimately get thrown in the trash. Right? So what we want to do is we want to bring the annotations, all that good design thinking, into the final pattern library, into that final interface. So with our annotations, what we're doing is you could actually select an element and give it an annotation, and you could click on that thing and it'll show you some text about it. And this will also work. This is for Time Inc. So we have their color palette, and we wrote some words about that. We have their font stack, and basically saying blah, blah, blah. These fonts are being loaded by Typekit and things like that. All these design considerations need to be baked in to the final living, breathing style guide in order for them to be effective. Also includes lineage. And what lineage does is allows you to not just see things in this abstract form, but to also get a sense of where this pattern is being used and what this pattern is made of. So for this little pattern with the little circle image, I'm including a little pattern called Adams Square. I'm just using CSS to round the corners. And then this pattern, which I'm calling Block Media Link, naming things are hard, is included in the following patterns: in the profile navigation, in the section media list, in this settings account, and the account edit. So what this allows you to do is really gives you an idea of what pages would you need to test if you made an update to this, right? What would you need to go back through in QA? How global is this pattern, right? Is this pattern being used at all? There's a bunch of other stuff that Pattern Lab does. If you want to check it out, it's patternlab.io. Again, this isn't a sales pitch for that. It's more about sort of the principles behind crafting an effective design system, an effective pattern library for your organization. And if you do end up using it and something goes wrong, not my fault. Blame the other guy that works on this with me. So, this whole responsive design thing is pretty hard. And I threw the question out there a while ago, so what's the hard part about it? Is it the design challenges? Is it the development challenges? Is it responsive images? Is it that? Or is it updating your process and workflow and dealing with people? Mark Bolton has a great line. He says, the design process is weird and complicated because it involves people who are weird and complicated. I think that's especially true with all of this. So, in order to work this way, in order to really embrace responsive design, in order to embrace this kind of atomic thinking, we really had to reset our clients' expectations. Tell me if this sounds familiar or looks familiar. Let's review the website. Right? Gather around the table. Bill's going to go to the printer. We'll wait 5 minutes for him to print out the copy deck, right? We'll write in the margins and stuff like that. This is not how you interact with the website. I'll tell you right now, right? My friend Dan Mall, who I had the good fortune of working with, says, as an industry, we sell websites like paintings. Instead, we should be selling beautiful and easy access to content, agnostic of device, screen size, or context. And that's a really big change, right? Just even looking at an iPhone, an iPad, a desktop machine, right? You know that things just can't continue on the way they always have. The landscape has shifted. And that also means getting away from the old traditional style of working, which is the waterfall method, right? I might add that this dude is wearing business casual to fall down a waterfall. He's dressed up for the occasion. Thought that was pretty considerate, right? But tell me if this sounds familiar, right? You create that 300-page wireframe document with all the annotations and all that stuff that goes through design review phase, and the clients go, sure, this looks good, yeah, sure. And then you pass it over to the visual designers, and those visual designers color in the lines, right, and make it look pretty. And once they're finished with homepage underscore version 17 underscore final underscore v2 underscore final final underscore for review underscore final, and the budget is blown 3 times over, and the timeline is like, yeah. And eventually, those designers, those visual designers, go over to tiptoe over to the development cave, right? It's always a cave in a basement somewhere, and they slip the designs under the door, and they say, "Get this done in 2 weeks. We're already behind. Bye." Right? Sound familiar? Right? So this is a massive shift, right? We have to think of front-end development, right? The HTML, CSS, that interface development work as part of the design phase, as part of the design process. And this is something I've struggled with my entire career. Basically, because I write code, even if it's just HTML and CSS, which aren't real programming languages, but because I'm writing code, like, oh, you're a developer, so go sit over by the Ruby people and whip us up some gems. And I'm like, write us some middleware, normalize this database. I'm like, I've never had a computer science class in my life. My mom is an art teacher. I am not a developer. I don't belong in that cave. I belong, with the rest of the designers. But because we work in code, there's this massive misconception. There's this giant chasm between anything that's design and anything that happens to incorporate code. This needs to change. So instead of this, right, this archaic process, we need to have these cross-disciplinary teams working together, working on the same problems at the same time, coming up with sound solutions. And this is a little inaccurate because it's not like everybody's guns blazing all the time throughout the process. It looks maybe a little something more like this, right? Of course, at the beginning of the process, where all that important strategic thinking and that design thinking and IA work and content strategy work, of course those people are going to be, burning hot and doing a lot of work. But that doesn't mean that visual designers can't get started exploring visual treatments, and that developers can't get started setting up environments and setting up these atoms and molecules and organisms. So once we sort of reset that expectation with our clients, basically like, hey guys, things are different, and we're going to do things differently. And the things that we show you are deliverables. All of this stuff is going to be different. Once we get the okay for that, then we go into sort of a gathering phase. So how do you take an existing web experience, right? There's something that might have existed for maybe even a decade, right? How do you take this and start to deconstruct it? How do you establish a sound design system? Well, in order to do that, you could conduct what I call an interface inventory, which is similar to, if you're familiar with a content inventory, it's this mind-numbing process. You go through and slap in all these URLs from the site, and you say who owns it and all this. It's a very tedious process, but also very important work, right? So that's what an interface inventory is, only you're taking into account all the different unique patterns on your website. So this is interface inventory of all the buttons from my bank, who I hate with a burning passion. And you can sort of see why, right? This isn't even their whole site. This is just a few pages of their site. And I came across all these different unique styles, right? The Learn More is in 17 different shades of orange, and all these arrows are all misaligned and different drop shots. This is awful, right? But this exercise, this interface inventory, allows you to sort of go through and really take stock of what your interface is made of, right? What your different categories of interface are. What do our form fields look like? How do we sort of show this stuff, right? If you contrast my banks with, this is Etsy's website that uses a really, tight style guide driven process. You can see this is much more deliberate, right? These are all the buttons on their interface. But even them, right, going through and sort of taking stock of what widgets, right, what little interactive widgets they have on their site. Maybe there's an opportunity to sort of consolidate some of these patterns, right? It also sort of helps you establish the scope of work, right? How long would this take to convert these things into a responsive environment, right? How long would this take to make sure that it works on touch devices, on other environments? So that's interface inventory. You're documenting your interface, looking for inconsistencies, right? Do this exercise. It's like a day's worth of screenshotting, and then put it on your boss's desk at the end of the day and say, look, we got to deal with this, right? And doing this exercise also helps lay the groundwork for your future style guide and pattern library, right? You're forced to name things. You're forced to categorize things. So once we sort of go through that gathering phase, including the content strategy and things like that, then we start getting into actually designing some stuff. And historically, again, this is where people would go away and create this really high-polished, high-fidelity mock-up and show it to the client, say, what do you think? Aren't you impressed? Right? But that's not what we're after, right? So much can be accomplished with just a simple sketch. A friend of mine, she's a preschool teacher in the Washington, D.C. area in the U.S., and she had a student ask, how do you make a website? And she goes, well, as it turns out, I know a guy, a friend of mine, he makes websites for a living. So they gave me a FaceTime call, and this 4-year-old girl named Ava asked me, how do you make a website? I said, well, it's typically a good idea to go through and just sort of sketch and draw what you want that website to be. And so a couple hours later, I get this back. This 4-year-old girl is more talented than 90% of the designers I've ever worked with. Clear labeling, right color coding, proper hierarchy, active states, 4 years old. This is the home page. Again, clear hierarchy of information, more active states. Her buttons are more consistent than my banks. Like, this is amazing, right? But I love showing this because, this isn't the most highly polished, design in the world. This is just a sketch, right? Ideas are meant to be ugly, as Jason Santamaria says, right? And so it's what can you communicate, right, with as little effort as possible. So for the TechCrunch project, we were able to go through and just sort of establish these rough design patterns, right? This wasn't, anything crazy. This was just sort of blocking out what general patterns we were going to use. And from a visual standpoint, we use things like style tiles. What style tiles are just little suggestions, right, as to sort of what color palette we're thinking of and what sort of font explorations we're looking at, maybe some texture, and maybe even some interface elements. And this isn't a deliverable in the sense that, here, tell me what you think on Thursday. This is a conversation starter. Right? This is, how do we want to, how on brand is this? How does this feel? Are we going in the right direction? Does this feel right? Starting with type, right? Really extracting that conversation and putting it in isolation. So we use a tool called Typecast that allows you to sort of stitch together these web fonts and put together a bunch of different font treatments. And then again, we'd have a conversation with the client. Like, how do you feel about these font treatments? Do you feel like this is in the right direction? And they would say things like, this feels a little too conservative. This feels a little too bulky. And then we were able to sort of hone in on that, all without having to do very much work at all. And that's the idea, is we're just trying to sort of establish a direction. And from my end, I was able to get started in the code right away. again, establishing those atoms and molecules, right? Establish block quotes and pull quotes. And at the beginning, they didn't look like much, right? This is what it looked like at the end, but we knew we were going to have ads on the site, which is a nightmare. It's a different conversation altogether. But, we were able to sort of address this stuff right up front, right? Pull in all of our ad atoms and make sure that we're accommodating for them in our designs as we go through. So once we establish that vision, then we really roll up our sleeves and get to work and really start blocking out what's going to go on each page, right? What does the home page look like? What patterns comprise that home page? And what I was able to do is, as soon as the people working in a static wireframe environment got started, I was able to follow right behind them and put all of this stuff into the browser. If you look at this looks like shit, right? This is awful, but at the same time, that's okay, right? At this stage in the game, I'm just sort of wiring things up, getting things ready. We'll sort of tackle the aesthetics of that later. And from a visual standpoint, we're able to use things like element collages, which are a little more concrete than style tiles, right? Because you're actually moving into interface design. But there's still explorations. It's like, how do you feel about this? This is what an accordion might look like. This is what pagination might look like. How do you feel about this? Is this still going in the right direction? And we would have conversations about a specific organism, right? A specific chunk of the interface. So this is what Dan came up with for the initial header exploration. We'd have a conversation about it, and we'd say, oh, we don't really like how the ads stacked on top and all that. And all the while, I'm sort of in the background working in the browser, stitching things up, getting things ready to go. And eventually, this is what the header became. And so we'd end up sort of just iterating over this process, right? Sort of going through sort of module by module, slowly building fidelity, right? And eventually, we would get to a point wherever we'd have full comps, right? It's only at this stage, only once we've established that design direction and established those design patterns, did we really roll up our sleeves and actually design some real actual pages. And that's great, because we weren't leading with this. This is an accurate portrayal of what's realistic, because we've already done a lot of groundwork for that. So that was our process, right? Just sort of building up fidelity over time. That sort of interaction, that collaboration, communication between clients, the designers, the developers, and everybody else involved in the project, right? That's what we need in order to launch successful work. Because, again, this is a humbling image right here. This sort of like makes you want to go be a farmer or something. And you're like, nope. But this is our reality, ladies and gentlemen. So it is up to us to rise to the occasion. I love this quote from Benjamin Franklin. He says, when you're finished changing, you're finished. Right? I think that that's especially true for a medium that's less than 25 years old, right? It's ridiculous to have best practices and to sort of get set in your ways for a medium that's so incredibly young, right? This is hard work. We haven't had this all figured out yet, so we have to be willing to adapt and change in order to be successful. And for as hard as it is, let's face it, this is pretty damn fun, right? We make wonderful digital creations, right? And all this atomic stuff actually reminds me of playing with Legos as a kid. That's pretty awesome. Well, I get paid for it now. How cool is that, right? We could have about 1 million different worse jobs, and I think that it's important to celebrate that. Lastly, there's about 7 billion mobile subscriptions on the face of the planet, and about 2.4 billion people with access to the web. And increasingly, more people getting online, more people with mobile phones, more people getting online through their mobile phones. These are two of humanity's greatest technological achievements. And where are we? Right smack dab in the middle, trying to make it all work well together. I personally can't think of better problems to have than to figure out what the web is, where it can go, how it gets used, who uses it, and why it matters so much. Thanks for listening.